Hello and welcome to Get Informed America, the show that breaks through the mainstream media box to bring you real smart news. Hi, I'm Dave Oakenquist, and joining me is the editor of InformedAmerican.com and the smartest man I know, Mr. Rodney Johnson. Rodney, good morning.
Morning, Dave.
Rodney, another week and another barrage of news, but we seem to
Yep.
be kind of circling around a couple of topics over and over again over the last couple of weeks. Of course, we had the shootings, the one in Atlanta and the one in Boulder, Colorado, and Rodney, the ongoing crisis at the southern border. So I think that has been the focus over the last couple of weeks. And there was some news yesterday, Rodney. Joe Biden gave a press conference.
Yeah.
It's the
First time.
Yeah, it was
First time President Biden has ever given a press conference.
Yeah, and it was I believe the longest drought in over 100 years in terms of president waiting from the time he was inaugurated to giving a press conference. I don't know if you sat through the full hour and 2 minutes, Rodney, did you?
I didn't quite catch any of it. So just,
Well, never fear. I am here to inform you, Rodney, some of the highlights. No, I did not watch the entire press conference. I watched some of the highlights from it, and it appeared to be a very, let's say, structured press conference. We'll leave the interpretation up to the viewer on that. But a couple of highlights here. As I noted, immigration and gun control are priorities of the presidential agenda going forward. He got a lot of questions on the border. He said he was going to double the vaccination goal to 200 million doses, and I want to talk on that in just a bit, Rodney. But something that, also the Senate filibuster. So he used some vague, threatening language about ending that. I don't know if you take that anyway or not. There was some comments by Manchin that said, no, never, I'm never going to end the filibuster. But something interesting, Rodney. Biden said he's going to run in 2024. What do you make of some of the highlights I noted and the idea that President Biden will run again in 2024?
I did read the press conference. So, I stayed up to it, although I wasn't going to watch a whole hour of it, just like I don't watch political speeches. Of course, he's going to say he's going to run again, because why wouldn't you think you're going to run again, right? You would never put that out there as no, I'm not going to, and make yourself a lame duck on purpose. It would be silly. And so whether or not he intends to run, I don't know. I don't know the man's mind. I can only go by what he says. And so if he says he's going to run again, I believe him.
I'm not sure anybody knows the man's mind. Okay, so you believe? So you're just going to take those? All right. So you take the statement at face value.
Yep.
But do you think he will run again in 2024?
I can't know. I mean, because he'll be 82 years old. And so it's a time in life where a lot of things happen, right? There a lot of bad things happen for your personal health, your spouse's health, all sorts of things that could affect him and change his mind. And so there are many more variables that he will have to deal with over the next 4 years than somebody in their 50s would have to deal with. It just is. And so I can't know, but I got to tell you, I think it was the least interesting thing of his entire press conference was talking about that. It was a throwaway that somebody asked him. I was much more interested in what he had to say about the border and even, the filibuster, as you mentioned a minute ago.
Is there any chance that this filibuster reform is something that's been bandied about, particularly with a deadlocked Senate? Is there? How would you wager any kind of filibuster reform? Because what they really want to do is to get rid of the 60 vote threshold, but that seems difficult.
I don't think Democrats want to get rid of it. I think if I'm looking at this as an outsider and I ask myself, well, is there any precedence for this? And there is. There was a change from 2/3 to 60 back in, I think, 70, 72, somewhere in there. But it has been this more or less, the minority can hold this up a bit. And the one big change came under Harry Reid, at which time Mitch McConnell said, you're going to live to regret this. And it wasn't about, 6 seconds later that they lived to regret this, because then, of course, they put in some judges, but then Mitch McConnell turned around and used it for Supreme Court judges. And then all of the judges that Trump put into place that are lifetime appointments. And so there is an historical precedence for the party who changed this to regret it in a really big way within just a couple of short years. And so I think the goal isn't necessarily to change the filibuster, maybe, change some of the or some of the ways you do it, like having somebody actually stand up there and talk, which isn't that bad of a deal because you keep switching out people. It's more to persuade Republicans to play ball on some of these other things. And it's that silver sword of Damocles hanging over them, saying, if you don't come to the table on some of this, then I might go try and do that. But I don't think they actually want to, and I don't think Joe Manchin's going to let them.
Ronnie, we would expect some gun control legislation to come down the pipe in just a couple of weeks, right? I would assume, and something on immigration. What do you think the timeline on that is? There seems to be a big push, particularly in the wake of the last two shootings.
So, gun control legislation is actually something that's favored by a majority of Americans in very small pieces. And so, if you say, well, hey, I would like for there to be at least some control for people who sell guns at gun shows, to make sure that people who have, criminal records and everything else are not buying them. Um, and that sort of thing actually gets widespread approval from the American public. The problem is it's a slippery slope to other things really, really quickly, right? And so it's like, well, if you do this little bit, if you open the door a little bit, somebody's going to want to kick the door wide open and make it to where, well, if we think that you might be a problem one day, we're going to come take your guns, the red flag rules and things like that.
Yeah.
And so those don't get a lot of support from the American public. And so I think you're going to see legislation proposed, but it always gets bogged down in the details because people want to make sure there are very bright lines on how far this can go. And if something like that shows up, I think people would be more or less behind it. But I haven't seen anything that says that either one of these people, the person, the young man in Atlanta or the even younger man in Boulder, would have been caught up in these rules because they might have had some issues in the past, but they didn't raise to the level of them not being able to legally possess firearms that I'm aware of. I may be wrong on that, but I didn't see anything like that yet.
And I think you make a good point where for a topic or an issue where there is popular support for change, but then that's not necessarily what makes it into the bill, and then nothing gets done, and then we wonder why, and people screaming, why aren't we doing something about it? Well, I guess there's your answer, right, Rodney? If you get broad support for some common sense thing, but then you slip in a whole bunch of other stuff, and then the opposite party says, no, I don't want that, and then here we are deadlocked again. What
Well, and that's the nature of politics, right? The bicameral approach, which is what we have, is purposefully hard because you're changing laws, you're changing the way we're governing the population, and you don't want it to be easy because then things could change on a whim very quickly all the time, and we could end up in this whipsaw with a zillion laws that are crazy, which is kind of where we are. But this ability to put an amendment on anything is what drags us down, because it's rare for a streamlined piece of legislation to make it to the floor for a vote, because everybody tags on the stuff they want, and then that's where the fight is. It's rarely in the main idea. It's in all these amendments that get attached.
Something related to that I was going to get to a bit later, but I think I'm going to jump in right now, considering something with popular support, which seems to go absolutely nowhere, is something you wrote on informedamerican.com. A large majority of likely voters support voter ID laws. Yeah. So why don't congressional representatives? Good question, Rodney. This comes from a Rasmussen poll saying 75% of likely voters support voter ID laws, which would require voters to show valid IDs at the polls to cast their ballots. And maybe not surprisingly, more Republicans, 89%, support such laws, but 60% of Democrats and 77% of non-party, non-official, or independent voters. There was a recent law passed in Georgia, Rodney. I don't know if you saw that. The Governor Kemp just signed something into law that essentially requires you to at least show an ID for absentee voting. And this is called a violation of civil rights. I don't quite get this, Rodney. If you have a good argument why someone shouldn't have to show an ID to vote, I'd like to hear it. What is your take on this, where it has large, broad support across the country, but yet this never comes up really in any kind of debate or anything like that, and nothing ever gets done about it? What do you make of this situation with voter ID?
I think I make the same thing of it everybody else does. It's really easy to call somebody a racist, bigot, something terrible here. And it's all about tagging your opponent. It has nothing to do with the intent of the law. Because if you look at this, it's already the law in states like New Jersey, states like Colorado. You don't think of those as bastions of conservatism that are out to get people. And the whole idea of showing your ID, you actually just have to write your ID number to vote by mail in Georgia. You don't have to show anything. And so if there's a signature question, people call up and then want your ID. And so none of this is onerous. It's easier to vote than it is to buy a pack of cigarettes, and it's one of those things where it's common sense, but common sense is not what people are after. They're about scoring points against their opponent for the next election. That's all it is.
Ronnie, since you don't like watching political speeches, and I believe this last round of presidential debates you may have skipped as well, but I'm a fan of them. I tend to tune in over the years. I don't think voter ID has ever come up. Something that people like and doesn't get done, and it makes you wonder. If there's no real public debate over it, then we can just erode it slowly on the back end without anyone really even noticing, and people are mad. But here's a change, and one of the proposed changes is HR1, which you write in the article, something we covered a couple of weeks ago. The bill says that if a state has a requirement for an individual to present an ID to cast a ballot, like the Georgia example we used, the state shall permit the individual to present to election officials a sworn written statement under the penalty of perjury attesting to the individual's identity that they are eligible to vote. Now, under the penalty of perjury sounds really strong and tough, but does anyone ever really check these things?
I have no idea, right? And do people? First of all, people do get caught. There are cases of voter fraud that go on. There's a case here in Texas, and I believe it was Republicans. It was in a city race, right? It was about controlling a city. I think Farmers Branch or Carrollton up there between Dallas and Fort Worth, and it was very recent. And so this does happen, but you don't hear about it in really big numbers because I know it's hard to do. And so while it's hard to make a difference in an election, right? And so if it's a city election, the numbers of voters are small, where it's much easier to sway it. But in something like a presidential election, which is the only place where the federal government can have a say in this sort of thing, you would have to be very specific in picking the right places to make a difference, and it would have to be very close. And so that's the problem with this sort of thing with fraud at the national level, is it takes such a big effort to make a difference in the election. And clearly a lot of people think that it did, but I don't know. I find it interesting. I still think voter ID is a really easy thing. Yeah, if I have to show my ID to do anything else in this world, why don't I have to show my ID to cast a ballot for the people that are going to make laws that govern how I live?
So you don't find an ID requirement to be too onerous on someone's civil rights to be able to cast a ballot?
I do not, and I will tell you that I don't say that lightly. I understand where the view comes from. I understand the historical perspective of it. But anybody can get a state ID for free, just like I can get a driver's license for free. It's very easy to get a replacement for any of the documents relating to your birth and your Social Security to prove who you are, and as an adult. And so, no, I don't think it's onerous at all. And I think it's one of the things we should be doing to make sure that we are doing our civic duty of having citizens vote.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly to the ability to participate in society is greatly hampered if you don't have identification, just for, I mean, really just basic
Well, the question
stuff.
becomes, if you don't have an ID, what else are you doing, right? Are you buying stuff? Do you have a credit card? Do you have a bank account? Do you drive? Do you buy anything that requires an ID? Do you travel anywhere that requires an ID? And so I would like to meet the group of people that do not have IDs, like as in don't possess them, where this is creating a burden. And the same effort that is put into registering people to vote, why don't you just get these people an ID and make their life so much simpler for everything else they have to do? I mean, if you're going to have a get out the vote campaign, why don't you have a get out and get your ID campaign and drive people on a random Tuesday in August in an off election year to the local, department of whatever in your state that handles this sort of thing, and get those people IDs, because you would actually be doing them such a greater service, because now they have an ID card for everything else they do that is clearly impeded by the fact that they don't have one.
What
And I
about
would argue that if you did such a thing, you would find out there are 6 people somewhere that don't have an ID. And by the way, they don't want an ID because their entire goal is to be off the grid and away from the government.
So then I would assume a national ID program wouldn't solve this then, because you're saying this is such a small issue that it would not, it should not be. It's only a problem at the tiny margins, which would make even this idea of presenting an ID for an election completely silly.
I think it is a problem created by people who want to tag their opponents with something nasty in an election. That's what I think it is.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, let's move to immigration. As I promised, you wrote here earlier in the week, migrants in Mexico worth more to cartels than dope. Rodney, human trafficking is is a booming business south of the U.S. border. And there was a quote here from Fox News saying border traffickers earning as much as $14 million a day. Wow. This is not good, Rodney. But you know, with the cartels, I mean, they're finding that it's better to move people than drugs. I mean, this what level of craziness are we reaching here?
Well, I found the article interesting because it also listed out the price by nationality, right? This is interesting because if you're moving somebody from Mexico across the border, it's a few $1,000. But if
Yeah.
you're moving somebody from Central America, it's a little bit more. But if you're from Asia, the number goes up. And if you're from the Middle East, it's like, 5 digits. And so it's like a Chinese menu. It's like, well, okay, show me your ID. Here we go with IDs again, and I'll tell you what the price is. And so it's kind of crazy. But look at it from the reverse of if you get caught. If I get caught as a person with other people in a group walking toward the U.S. Mexican border in Mexico, right? Up from the south to the north.
Yeah.
And a police officer rolls up on me. Well, what have I done? I'm walking, right? And so I'm walking with other people. Well, which one's the leader? Well, I don't know. We're all kind of standing here together. We're in a group. But if I happen to have a knapsack full of coke or heroin, I have a whole different issue. And so consider the risk of being caught with a group of people versus being caught with drugs. And it's so different that immediately you can say, wow, I can see how this would be pretty beneficial, because the only way I get caught and get into trouble is if I'm actually over the border and I'm identified as the person who is the smuggler. And by the way, I've threatened all these people not to identify me. If we get caught, everybody says that the smuggler ran off. That's the deal. And so if you're carrying drugs, you have to deliver the drugs, or you have a whole different issue with the people who sent you on your mission. And so I can see how moving people instead of drugs over the border would be a great idea.
Rodney, is human trafficking the way to end the war on drugs?
No, that's not the way to end it. But the bigger problem, of course, is motivation. It's something we've talked about before. If I'm in Guatemala and my life is horrible and the lives of my children are not good and don't have good prospects, and the gangs are circling around and threatening people in my town, I want a better life. And I really don't care who says what. I'm going to do anything I can to get a better life for my children. Certainly me as a secondary. And if that means, evading some laws as I move north and try to get across the US border, I'm going to do it. And so we can't change that metric in the United States. And certainly there's some money we're going to put toward it again. We're going to put billions of dollars into the pockets of all of the crooked people in Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador again. And it's not going to fix what's going on there, because they do not go after the gangs. And we just have to figure out smarter border procedure. And we just don't have it yet.
And to that point, Rodney, there was a story from Gallup titled 42 million want to migrate to the U.S. 42 million. There are 33 countries in Latin America. Roughly 400 million adults live in the region. Gallup asked them if they'd like to move to another country permanently. A whopping 27% said yes. That means roughly 120 million would like to immigrate somewhere. Gallup then asked them where. Of those who would like to leave their country permanently, 35% or 42 million said they'd like to go to the United States. Seekers of citizenship and asylum are watching to determine exactly when and how this best time is to make their move.
Now, so you have to separate that idea of people who say, I would like to permanently move somewhere, and the United States is kind of the top of my list, from the people who are actively making plans and moving that direction, selling possessions, making a plan, making travel arrangements, doing the things. I don't know what the number is, but we clearly have a number, right? And what I found interesting about that is that Gallup poll just looked at the 33 Latin American and Caribbean nations.
Yeah.
It didn't even talk about the people from Asia, right? The Philippines and India and China. As you and I have discussed many times, about half of the illegal immigrants in the United States did not come across a river. What they did was fly here on a plane with a travel visa of some sort, be it student visa or whatever, and then overstayed their visa. And so there's a lot of people who are saying, you know what, I'm going to get to the US and stick around, who are not trying to hire some person in Mexico to walk them, through the desert. They're instead just getting a student visa and planning on staying.
By the way, those are the people who are most likely to have received a stimulus check.
Right,
Right.
because they get a social security card because they work and do the other things. So yeah, absolutely.
That's exactly right. But I mean, this is a bigger question. We don't have too much time left here before we get out of here, but maybe this can be expanded on later. But 42 million is a lot. If we didn't look at other countries or those who come over on visas and decide, heck, the chances of me getting deported are very, very slim if I just simply overstay my visa. There's 330 million people here, Rodney. I mean, we're is there a natural limit? I mean, are we talking like a billion people in the United States over the coming decades? How and where does this end? Because the incentives are we had basically a lull in incentivizing immigration to the United States for about 2 or 3 years, and now everything's back in business. So for Americans who are wondering, it's feeling pretty full here. Housing's pretty expensive. Yes, the United States is a big country, but a lot of it is uninhabitable, and wages are down. This whole thing. I mean, what kind of a landscape could we be looking at for people who are concerned about that?
Well, you paint a whole different picture of the United States than I've seen. I mean, certainly housing is getting more expensive, but housing is not expensive in the United States, particularly when you get away from very large cities.
You should come to my county.
Well, that's just it. You live near the coast, right? And so you're in a place where retirees are moving in droves. But go outside of Kansas City, you're not going to have this. But my point is that we have a lot here. Unemployment is around 6.2%. The Fed's numbers from last week show it falling to 4.5% this year. Remember, we were celebrating a year ago when it was 3.5% because it was a 50-year low, for goodness sake. And so the Fed says GDP is going to be 6.5%. They're probably low. Goldman has it over 7. And so the point is that there's a lot of economic activity going on in the United States, which is the draw. We saw Mexican migration actually reverse 2008 through about 2018, 2019. More migrants were going home than coming because things were getting better in Mexico. And so that's actually what slows it down. It's not necessarily that, we lock the door and say, hey, we're done with this because we're full. That's proven really hard to do. Instead, it's people lose their motivation to come here because the situation on the ground has changed, either the opportunity once they get here, right, or the opportunities they have at home.
What about the American worker here, Rodney? I saw a report recently that 2/3 of entry-level tech jobs go to foreign workers. That seems like a problem to me. What do you make of that?
A problem to me too. I think it's twofold. I think entry-level tech workers, one, we're not training our people very well when they come out of high school and come out of college. And I think that's obvious by the math scores that we're putting up compared to other nations. Yeah. And two, we're allowing staffing companies to game the lottery system for work visas. And that has, like I said, we need common sense visa programs and we don't have them. There's no question. We let all of these working and staffing companies put in a zillion different people in the lottery, which increases their chances because they essentially buy more tickets.
And for foreign students at universities is another pipeline into tech companies. And this is I don't have a poll in front of me, but I'm sure most Americans would support some restrictions on this. And Rodney, does anything get done?
No, because the money is too good. Universities, the numbers are down dramatically over the last couple of years, as you might imagine, but with the pandemic. But universities charge foreign students not just full tuition, but a foreign student differential. And so the very first thing universities are going to do, state universities, is look back at the states and then the federal government and say, look, you've been cutting our funding since 2008. Unless you want us to charge American students more, you've got to step away from this foreign student thing because they actually pay the way of a lot of people who are here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like we're just scratching the surface. I think it's the first time we've actually delved a little bit deeper into the broader immigration issue. So it's good to talk about that. It's something certainly on people's mind, and now front and center, seeing the news. The final question here, Rodney. Biden said he's going to take a tougher stance on what's going on the border. He put Kamala Harris in charge, who, as I noted earlier in the week, compared ICE agents to the KKK. Do you expect the action to follow the rhetoric here?
There will be some action, but there's no question. They can say anything they want. The very first thing they did was soften some of Trump's policies and what he was doing in terms of repatriation and, of course, the migrant protection protocol, keeping people in Mexico. And so those things send a clear signal that it's easier to get in and easier to stay. And that's what people respond to. So all the words in Washington and, you know, the mainstream media or whatever else about Biden saying, don't come, don't come. Yeah, whatever. The actions, that's what matters. And people say, look, if you get there, you've got a shot at staying. He's actually, you know, allowing people to stay without even giving them court dates. And he's using Title 42, which in an odd way, which is the one where you can immediately repatriate people or put them back over the border without going through the process because you're claiming it's a health concern. Mm-hmm. That encourages people to try many times because they don't go through the deportation system, so they don't have a potential criminal record from it. That's the big thing, right? Is you try and you fail, we kind of put a mark by your name. You try a second time and fail, you're not allowed to come for, I want to say 10 years. And so this whole thing with 42, man, you just keep trying until you make it. And so I think we're going to see some more work out of it. If I was Kamala Harris, I'd be scratching my head wondering if this was a good thing because no one has solved the border issue yet. And when I say no one, I mean all the way back to Lyndon Johnson when he signed, you know, the original act to kind of open this up. And so kicking it to her, if this blows up or has bad optics, she's going to own this thing. And that, I imagine she didn't sign up for having that one task.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, great point there. So this is, depending on the extent, people are not happy about this at all. You can see the anger out there, despite the administration's attempts to sort of keep information flow to a minimum. This is not going away. And as you said, it's been ongoing for decades. Well, Rodney, I want to thank you for joining me today. I want to thank you all for watching. And we always want you to hang out here at informedamerican.com. Comment down below. Let us know what you think about all the topics we discussed. If you're watching on Facebook, if you happen to be catching us there, please hit the like button, share the video with your friends. If you're catching us on YouTube, please hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to this channel. But as I said, we want you to hang out at informedamerican.com. Our small corner of the internet. We're building a growing community here of like-minded people discussing ideas in a somewhat biased manner, Rodney, but we try to be as fair as possible, don't we? It's just my bias. Well, thank you for coming here and dealing with my biases. Ronnie, I do try to present both sides of the issue, even though to come down with a bit of a strong opinion here or there. We want you to join 250,000 subscribers by joining our totally free email list. Rodney, if they do so, what kind of stories can they expect to get in the coming days ahead?
Now, the border is certainly going to be front and center as the weather warms up a little bit. But I think you're going to see a lot about this new infrastructure plan and taxes. People are going to be talking about taxes coming back. And then it's reopening. This is it, right? We're coming up on Easter week next week with Good Friday, Monday, Thursday, Good Friday. And then you're going to see a lot of people out and about. And the difference between the U.S. and what we're able to do reopening the economy and what's going on in Europe is going to get bigger and bigger because Germany's looking at their fourth surge and a bad set of facts. And so that's going to be a pretty big story.
Great. For Rodney Johnson, I'm Dave Oakenquist telling you to get informed, America. We'll see you next week.
You've been listening to Get Informed, America, brought to you by the Informed American Radio Network. Please like and subscribe today in order to get new exclusive weekly episodes. Any questions, thoughts, or comments can be sent directly to info@informedamerican.com. And don't forget to visit informedamerican.com to keep up with real, smart news. Until next time, fight fake news and find common ground.